upgrading and installing Windows. In this nugget, we talk about upgrading and installing current versions of Windows, and we have a lot of different things to consider there in terms of what your applications are and if they're compatible, whether your hardware can handle the upgrade. Lots of different things to think about there, as well as the various options that present themselves to you during the installation process. I'll show you those on this on a whiteboard, but I'll also show them to you as we go through the installation, and we can do an installation by using the WinNT command or the WinNT32 command. Now, in our installations, these are going to be launched automatically, but you can also type them in from a command line. One's used for an upgrade and one's used for a clean install, and we'll see those differences. And then we'll also look at boot media. Do you want to boot from a floppy and then access a CD, or do you want to boot directly from a CD, boot from a network? Several different options for you there. And then at the end, I'll show you how I can do an unattended install from the network. Well, hopefully you don't get too many users that bring in computers that are running really old versions of Windows, such as Windows 95 or Windows 98. However, you will get them from time to time, and certainly you're going to need to be able to upgrade a lot of those machines, provided that the hardware can even handle a current Windows operating system. And from now on, when I say current Windows, I'll just mean Windows 2000 or Windows XP. But when we come into the upgrade scenarios here, we have a few considerations to make. First of all, you have to identify the kind of hardware that is already in that computer and see whether or not it's going to be able to take the upgrade to a more current version of Windows. So one thing you would do is to check to see if there's an updated driver for newer versions. So for example, if I'm running Windows 95 and I've got a Windows 95 driver operating a specific, let's say it's a sound card, then before I do the upgrade, I'll want to check and see if that manufacturer has an updated driver for Windows XP or Windows 2000. Very frequently, a driver for either version will work in both cases. And most major manufacturers have updated drivers for all of those things. Used to be in the early days of Windows 2000 and XP. It might be a little bit scarce, but while we were waiting for vendors to get caught up with writing new drivers, now it's not too bad. Not too bad. And then also, one thing you don't want to have is any kind of a real mode driver. This is a driver that directly accesses the hardware without going through the operating system. You cannot use real mode drivers in any current Windows because the NT architecture upon which all of them are based will not allow applications or drivers to directly access hardware. So especially if you're in the corporation and you have to update, let's say a whole department, maybe they are a little behind and you haven't been able to upgrade all of these maybe 100 machines. Well, you'd want to check through each one of those machines and see what kind of hardware they're running, what kind of applications and so forth, so you can make sure that it's going to get updated properly. And then the other thing you would check into is applications. First of all, take a look at the compatibility. Some applications, especially if they were written for Windows 3.1 or Windows 95 or 98, then it might be that those applications are just not even compatible at all with a current Windows operating system. And this incompatibility can take place a number of different ways. So for example, let's say that we forgot to check a given application. We went ahead and upgraded from Windows 95 to Windows XP. And then when we try to run this application, it just won't run anymore. It could give you any number of cryptic messages or errors with a big red X, and it just could be anything in terms of the incompatibility. Or it might just lock the system up. But regardless, what you need to do is, especially if you're doing this a whole department at a time, is to take one representative sample of a computer. Just take one as an example, and then go ahead and try to perform the upgrade with whatever the applications are that it has, and see if those applications properly run. And a big part of all of this, which is kind of an overriding thing for any kind of an upgrade, would be testing. Now, again, that's the case in a corporation because you don't want to upgrade 100 machines and then have the realization that none of them can run the critical business application anymore. If it's just an individual user's computer that they brought it into your shop, then you might consider doing an image of their hard drive before you do the upgrade, just in case. That way, if the upgrade fails, you can roll back to that image that you created before you started working on the machine. Also run a test and see what kind of privileges are needed to run that application after an upgrade. Because a lot of those down-level versions of Windows, and down-level means any of the 9X operating systems, for example, well, they would require that they would write to certain portions of the registry or file system who are under a FAT32 system and a less secure down-level operating system that didn't need any special privileges. But now, under Windows 2000 and XP, we need administrator privileges to access many parts of the registry and file system. And I haven't really explained the registry yet, but it's responsible for the great majority of configuration within current Windows operating systems. We'll address those in more detail a little bit later on. But what would happen here then is if the user trying to run that application on his newly upgraded computer did not have membership in, let's say, the administrators group, then they would not be able to run that application, which could happen in a number of different ways. It might just say a cryptic message of saying unable to write data, for example, which would be the case if it was trying to write data to a protected part of the file system. Or it might be able to say it was unable to read something if it was trying to read from a forbidden portion of the registry, for example. So the only way around that in that sort of a situation would be to make that user a member of the administrators group. That's not usually desirable in the corporation because that opens up too many avenues for potential trouble. Number one, if the user is careless and not adept at avoiding things like viruses and spyware, then they'll install themselves under his or her existing privileges. So if you made them an administrator, then that virus or that malware has installed with administrator privileges now, and it can be much more destructive than it might have otherwise been. And the other reason is simply as general troubleshooting, because if we give users too much privilege, then they can start to change things that they're not supposed to be changing, and they can result in a lot more help desk calls than they would otherwise have. Whereas most of the time, users are just members of the local users group, and this gives them the ability to run normal applications designed for current versions of Windows and do daily productivity work, but without necessarily messing up the configuration of a system. Another thing you'll see is that some of those older applications are just not very stable, so check the stability of those apps. Again, do it on a test machine and see if you can run the application in all of the aspects that a user would normally run it. See if it can print. See if it saves files properly. See if it works properly with the video driver. If it doesn't, then you might certainly have a stability problem there. So, in other words, just make sure that that application works out properly. And then there's also an interesting item on the A+ exam objectives where it says that we need to make sure that we have compatibility with the network. Now, this is really stated kind of in a weird way because it's rare that you ever would not have compatibility with the network. You know, what, Windows XP is not compatible with Ethernet? You know, Ethernet is not really operating system specific, so there's not really a compatibility issue there. The only thing that could really possibly be an issue with is if you have an older version of some network client and you need to make sure that you upgrade to the latest versions of the network client that support the more current versions of Windows, and make sure that you've got that in line before you go ahead and do your upgrade, because you wouldn't want to upgrade a whole slew of machines and then find out that you did not have a client available that would allow them to talk on the network, and then you would have a big mess on your hands. Also, you can just back up the data because, after all, if we're doing an upgrade and something bad happens, then we wouldn't want to be in a situation where we accidentally lost all of the data. Or if we got in a situation where we had to reset everything kind of back to zero and even format drives, we wouldn't want to lose the data that was on there. So you want to back that up. And that's kind of a mantra with the A+ exam objectives. Back up, back up, back up. Now, a couple of ways you can do that. You can use third-party software of your choice, or you can just copy the files to a network drive, or you can burn them to a CD. Or you can also use the imaging software, which I've alluded to many times, which is one of my preferred methods if you have the space to store an image. But the reason why I say backup data here also in an upgrade scenario is because we have a tool that's specifically designed to be able to transfer that information. It's called the File and Settings Transfer Wizard. I usually call it FAST as an acronym for the File and Settings Transfer Wizard. And this can be found under Start, All Programs, Accessories, System Tools, and then File and Settings Transfer Wizard. And as we select that item, let's say that I was about to upgrade this computer. Now I can run this wizard on any version of Windows pretty much, even like Windows 95. I would start this wizard and I would tell it that, you know, I want to keep whatever wallpaper I've got. You can see I'm pretty plain on wallpaper there. Not very creative apparently. But I might have certain taskbar configurations. My quick launch area here has just the icons I want on it, the shortcuts. I don't like to show the clock down here. So I can do a number of different preferences like that. Same thing would be true of my Internet Explorer settings. Maybe I've customized the security so that it will allow me to access certain sites, or maybe I customize my Outlook Express because I've got mail clients that I need to be able to download mail for, so I got all that custom configured. It took me a little while to get everything looking and working just like I want it. Well, that's what this would be for then, because when I get a new computer where it's been freshly upgraded or clean installed, then I don't want to lose all of those settings. Now let me also point out that what you're supposed to have happen is that if you upgrade, let's say an upgraded 98 machine to XP, if you do that upgrade, it should retain all of those settings that are associated with your user profile. So you're not supposed to lose any settings. However, just in case, run this file and settings transfer wizard anyway. The other scenario there where you would need it is if we had a new machine and an old machine. My old machine has Windows 98, but it won't handle the hardware required for Windows XP. So we had to get myself a new machine. Yippee for me. So I got a brand new machine, but I want to have all my settings moved over there. Well, that's what this would be used for then. And I would identify that this is my old computer, and I want to run through this wizard and then transfer it over to my new computer. And of course, you can see here all the versions of Windows that it can run in terms of the previous versions or the old computer. So now that's my old computer. I want to transfer all of my settings, and I click Next. And then it does a scan for all the different things that I have on my system that might be useful to transfer. Now, how can I make that transfer? If I've got both computers up and running right now, I can use a direct cable through my computer's serial ports. There's serial cables that will be able to transfer that data. And the serial ports are pretty slow, though. So the other way would be a home or small office network, and that would be a better way to transfer, like it says here, a larger amount of data. I don't have a floppy drive attached, so it doesn't make this available to me. Plus, most of the time, a floppy drive that stores only 1.44 megabytes worth of data is not going to be big enough to store a lot of the settings. It would store my user preferences, like my profile information probably, but not any data file. And then you could choose other as well, and then just choose an existing network drive or another drive on this computer that I'm not going to necessarily use during the upgrade, for example. But another option there would be a thumb drive or a flash drive. In my case, I'm just going to put this on a different drive here that's not the same one as my operating system is located on, and I'll just call this my settings. Okay? And I'll just click OK. And you can call it whatever you want to, of course. And then I'll just next through this. And then here it says, what do you want to transfer? Settings only, which again are things like preferential configurations, items that are on the start menu, items that are in the quick launch, the way my taskbar looks. And you see all the rest of it right through here, all the list of settings here, maybe accessibility settings. Or I could do files only. If I don't really care about all those preferences, I really just want data. And then it will scan through all of these directories and look for files of these types, and it will back up all of that information for me. And really what it does here is it backs up all the data in these folders, and then it retains the file type association that I have here as well. So that if I double click on, let me give it a good example, an AVI file, it identifies what kind of application will be able to back that up. Of course, I can again, choose both files and settings. I want to be a little bit more discreet here and customize the settings so you can see what kind of things you can choose from here. And then I can say, I don't really need the accessibility settings, so I can select that item and then remove. And I definitely want to keep my command prompt settings. Now, if I want to add an additional setting that's not in this list or that I've previously removed, I can click Add Setting, and you can see I can put accessibility right back if I want to. And I can do that for all of these different things that we see throughout here. I can also add a file. If there's a folder that this wizard is not scanning, maybe I created my own folder with its own files in it, I could click on Add File, and then I can specify wherever that document was. Maybe it's whatever that thing is. Then I could just open that, and I would have now added that to my list of files. By scanning down here to the bottom, we see that that document does appear here that I just added in. I can also add the file type, which again is the file association, what happens when you double click on something, or an entire folder at once if I want to as well. So then I'd go ahead and click on Next, and now it just copies all of the settings. It's also going to compress them into a file, but it'll copy all the settings, and then it will make it available for me when I want to restore this data to a different computer. I do have to use the File and Transfer Settings wizard, however, to be able to retrieve those settings. If I don't have it on the new computer, I can always bring it because it's always included on the CD-ROM for our current versions of Windows. And then, of course, to restore the settings to my destination computer, you just run the same wizard and you next finish through it, and it will restore all of your data. There's not that much to it in that respect. And then during the installation, I can configure additional components, or after the installation, when I'm done with the upgrade, if I realize something was missing that I used to have that I really liked, well, maybe I can go to Control Panel, and then from within the Add Remove Programs link here, by selecting that, I can choose Add Remove Windows Components. And here's where it will allow me to add something in that I might have forgotten to add in previously. And then, of course, you can just select or deselect these various items. If there's something within the accessories and utilities, for example, that I want to make sure I do or do not select, I can clear the checkbox or add the checkbox as necessary. Now I'm going to show you the installation options in a practical way as we actually go through an installation before too long here, but I want to point out some of the options here for you as well to cover the A+ exam objectives clearly. Number one, you can do the installation in an attended fashion. That's what I'm going to show you when I do the installation initially, and that's just where I manually go through each step and next finish my way through until it finally reboots and we have our new operating system installed. Now, that's a fine way to do it if I'm just doing it at home or if I only got one or two computers to do. But if I'm working for a corporation where we have dozens or hundreds of computers that I need to upgrade that way, then an unattended solution would be much better. One way to do that, again, would be through imaging and also something called sysprep, and I'll address that shortly. And then the other way would be using some kind of a scripting solution. So, for example, there are certain utilities, that some of which are included with Windows, that I can use to create a script or an answer file. And this answer file has all of the answers for the next finished parts of Windows already filled in for me. And that way I just kind of get the installation started and walk onto the next machine and get that one started and walk on to the next machine and get that one started. And they do all the rest themselves in terms of answering their own questions for the installation. Again, we'll see that shortly here. And then we also have the partition decision. With today's hard drives, man, you're likely to get new machines in that have 60, 100, 250 gigabytes worth of hard drive storage, and by the time you get this recording, it'll probably double past that. It's growing so fast right now that we have kind of an embarrassment of riches, to the point that we probably will not use all that hard drive space ever for most of your average users' desktops. But be that as it may, what we can do is to take our hard drive during the installation process, and we can carve out as much as we want for the operating system, and we might save the rest of it for certain kinds of data, or to divide it up into certain ways so that we can segment that drive accordingly. Let me give you an example of that. One way that I've often done this is if this is my hard drive, and it's really big. Let's just say it's a 300 gigger. Okay, 300 gigabyte hard drive. Well, I don't really need 300 gigabytes for the operating system. At the most, maybe I can picture 40 gigabytes. I'll just put a 40 there for the operating system. The other things that I might need are, I might need a big chunk of this for data. Maybe I work with a lot of digital photographs and video clips and media. Maybe I'm one of those folks that works in multimedia a lot. So this is about half. So let's say that's going to be 100 and, I guess it would be 100. It would be, let's say, make that 90 gigabytes for right now. So then we have another section of data over here. What would that be used for? Well, who knows? That's my whole point with these large hard drives right now. I have no idea what I would even need the rest of this for, but I might just leave it there, and then I can format it, or rather a partition and format it at a later point in time if I see that I do need to expand over into additional space. Maybe I'm starting to fill that part up. So that's the things we can do. We can partition them or divide them up as we need to. I guess that'd be 130 gigabytes I've used so far, and if I need more later on, I can do that. And then also the issue of formatting those drives, and we can do that during the installation as well. And then we have to determine if we want to format it as an NTFS file system, which is definitely the way to go. And of course, for your file systems, you have FAT, which is really going to be FAT32 in most cases, and then you also have NTFS. And again, certainly I want to go with NTFS under almost any circumstance at all. I'll argue with you all day long on that one if you want. It's just a better file system than FAT32. And then for the network configuration, you can configure what your TCP/IP properties are, what kind of clients you're going to be using, and so forth. We'll look at that as we do the installation. And then also device drivers. Hopefully you've scoped that out in advance and you know whether or not you have the drivers available, or if they're even available for download from the website of the manufacturer. But if you can at least get enough of the operating system installed to get you a desktop after the installation is complete, and you have some driver or some device that doesn't have a driver yet, maybe your sound card. Well, I don't need my sound card to boot Windows. At least if I can get to Windows, then I can go to the sound card manufacturer's website and download the current drivers for that, get my sound card in action. And then finally, there's just the issue of verification. We need to make sure that the installation did indeed go properly. And how do we do that? Number one, once you get to Windows here and you do your final reboot, it'll reboot several times during installation. But after the final reboot, it should give you a desktop. You should see your verdant green meadow back here and the default color scheme, which I'm using here and so forth. And you should be able to, get around in the operating system. But one thing you might want to do is to right-click on my computer and choose Manage. And this is a big part of completing the installation, and that is to make sure that you have all the drivers and all the devices in Device Manager that appear properly. Now, a red X, of course, means it's disabled. I manually did that because I'm not using that network card. But I'm really looking for a yellow circle with a black exclamation point on it. That's the thing that's going to show me, hey, this particular device, Plug and Play sees it there, but we don't know what to do with it. We don't have a driver for it. And that's where I would make sure that I were able to verify the installation, and that is that I can get the drivers for that particular device. Now also be aware of the fact that in terms of security, it is possible to write a device driver as a programmer and insert in that device driver some kind of malware, whether it's a virus or spyware or something else malicious. As a result of that possibility, Windows has configured it such that only members of the local administrators group will be allowed to install drivers. And the assumption, hopefully there, is that a member of the local administrators group would be more technically knowledgeable and would be less likely to install a malicious driver. And also, just a quick reminder, remember that if you do try to install a driver and you get a prompt from Windows saying that that driver is unsigned, you can continue on and allow that installation to continue, but unsigned drivers are not necessarily as stable as signed drivers, which give you the highest level of stability insurance. And if you want to change the default behavior of drivers that get installed as signed or unsigned drivers, you can right-click My Computer and choose Properties. And then when we go to the Hardware tab, we see that there's a driver signing option right down here in the middle. By default, it'll prompt you every time it sees that you're trying to install an unsigned driver. But you can also block it so that it never happens, or ignore it, meaning that it's just going to always install any driver that you select. And those are just the available options for you there. So let's go ahead here and take a look at an installation from Windows 98, and we're upgrading to Windows XP, and Windows 2000 is going to be very similar to this, so I'll kind of kill two birds with one stone and just show you the XP version. But what we want to do is to put the CD in the drive, and when we do that, autoplay will bring this up for us where we'll make a decision about what we want to do. One thing that I think is going to be very good for you to do, especially if this is the first of many installations you're going to do, is to check the system compatibility. And then you can select that item, and it will run through and identify any hardware or software that are known to be problems with Windows XP upgrades. Once you find that, then you'll be able to know in advance what kind of problems could occur, or possibly go to the vendor's website and download an update or a driver. So then let's go ahead and check our system compatibility. I'll click on the little arrow next to this item right here, and then I'll check my system automatically, and we can see that it'll give us the option to download additional files from the internet if we have an internet connection. I'll go ahead and say yes, and then click on next here, and then it will connect to Microsoft's website if it's available and if you have the internet connection. And it will download any updated information about the compatibility settings. Once it's done that, it'll go ahead and continue on through and prepare its upgrade report. This actually takes a little while, so I'm going to pause recording here, and I'll return to you when this is complete. Now then, here we see that it did find a problem with the VMware display adapter. Now I know from experience that this doesn't turn out to be a problem at all. I could go ahead and do the upgrade, and then I can reinstall what we call VMware Tools, and it resolves this issue. So that's not really an issue now, but if I didn't know about that issue in advance, I might need to look something up on the internet, go to the vendor's website, see if there's a knowledge base article about it, or do some other kind of research, or just download a more updated adapter for whatever it is I was looking at. Then if I want more details about it, I can just click on Full Details, and it gives you a whole slew of more information here if you want to know more about that. For my purposes, I'm just going to go ahead and click on Finish, and then I can just go back. Now that I have a knowledge of what's going on here, I can go ahead and decide to go ahead and install anyway, or prepare in advance and download the drivers that I'll need and so forth. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and go up here and click Install Windows XP, where it's going to read from the CD-ROM and start the installation process. And I'm going to kind of quickly go back and forth through this process because it does take a while, and we're not going to do this whole 60 to 90 minutes that it takes. I'm kind of going to do this in a little bit more of a staccato method here and show you the different options. Notice that the upgrade is recommended. That's only because it allows me to keep all of my existing settings and data and the like. Or I could do a new installation, which would require a little bit more knowledge of what I was doing, but it might require either a different separate disk or installation, or I would have to wipe out my existing ones. So in our case, we'll just go the easy way and choose the upgrade. And then, of course, you have to agree to the license agreement and enter in a product key. I'll enter the product key in, and then I'll click on Next. And then once I proceed past the CD key, it goes ahead and prepares the installation, and I'll pause it and show you any of the other screens that show up so you know what to expect. Now there are two key files you need to know about during an installation. One of those would be winnt.exe, and the other one is winnt32. With winnt.exe, this is what I would do if I had a clean install going on. So maybe I was booting from a floppy disk or something like that, and I had drivers to access my CD, and then I would change to my CD and just run. I would just type in winnt.exe and press enter. Now, of course, as with any executable or COM or batch file, you don't really need to type the extension, but I could just type this much, winnt, and then press enter, and then it would take me through the installation process and what we know as our real mode installation. This means that I'm not using Windows to interface or to act as a go-between between whatever my current actions and program is and the hardware. I'm doing it directly from programming on the CD directly to that hardware. That's where I'm installing from. And then with winnt.exe, I'll come to a point where I have to decide how many or which partitions that I want and where to make the installation go, which partition to put that installation in. This whole thing starts off by going into what we call a text mode, so that it's just going to look like, kind of like a DOS screen. It's actually blue in color for a lot of it. But I'll be in that kind of a mode. I won't have fancy windows and graphics, and I'll just type in any of the answers that I'm going to need to type in. And then I also have winnt32.exe, and this is what's used for an upgrade. When I put the CD in and that installation that's going on here in the background, Autoplay went ahead and launched a little splash screen for me that would allow me to click on the different options that I wanted. If I didn't have that, or if I didn't have autoplay enabled, or I wanted to manually launch it, I could have just as easily changed to the CD, D:\/ and typed in winnt32 and press enter. And that's what we use for an upgrade process where it will retain all of your existing settings. And in fact, even when I used the front screen that we saw there a moment ago to launch my installation, ultimately what happens is it just calls winnt32 and calls it into action, and that's what's actually going on in the background, that's what started the installation process. Now, while that installation is taking place in the background, let me talk about different ways of being able to boot the computer to get the setup process started. Number one, you could boot from the CD or DVD. Most operating systems these days, Linux, Windows, and so forth, they all have a CD or a DVD that is bootable. This didn't used to be the case back in the old days, and it used to have to be a real hassle. This is the best way to go if you're doing a manual installation, is to boot directly from the CD. If you put the CD in and you try to boot from it and nothing happens, it just says missing operating system or words to that effect, then check your BIOS to make sure that it's allowing you to boot to the CD as the first boot device. It might be trying to boot from a hard drive first instead, and when it can't find anything, then it will give you that error. And then the other thing you might be able to do there would be to boot from a floppy disk. And this is certainly the case for older hardware where it does not give you the ability to boot from a CD. For this, you'll need to craft your own boot floppy and be able to determine what's on that boot floppy in terms of system files. And then you need to make it that it gives you the ability to access either locally copied files, maybe you have a partition on that local computer where you've copied all the installation files that you can reference, or you need to make it allow you to connect over the network to a share where the installation files are, or you need to have drivers on that floppy that activate your CD or DVD drive so that you can then put the source files into that drive, of course from the manufacturer's CD. This is a method that is increasingly going away. We don't really see this much anymore because anything made in the past several years will have the capability of booting from a CD, which again is the easiest way to go. The other thing you could do is to boot from a USB flash drive, for example, but again, the system has to be able to support that capability. A lot of BIOS will look at a flash drive like it was another floppy drive, and so essentially the system will act the same way as if you were booting from a floppy if you boot from the USB drive, but once again, you'll have to have system files on that. Now, if you want to just give yourself a basic boot floppy, then what you can do is to go to an existing version of Windows 95, for example, or Windows 98, and you can create your own startup disk. Now, to get those files, what you can do is, and here I'm going to Windows 95, but it works with Windows 95 or Windows 98, go to Start Settings and Control Panel, and then from within here in Add Remove Programs, there's a Startup Disk tab where you can just put a floppy disk into a floppy drive, and then click create disk right here. And then it will copy all the files necessary to get a basic boot floppy going. From there, you can modify it as you want to. You can add drivers for the network. You can add drivers for your CD drive, for example, whatever it is that you need to be able to get the rest of this going. And then, of course, again, you can boot to the network as well. I'm going to show you that by demonstration here as well, and in different installation as we continue on here. This could take place in a number of different ways. Actually, two primary ways. Number one, you could boot from, say, a CD that has network drivers on it, or again, one of the floppy methods. And then you can map a network drive to a share that has your installation files, and then run winnt.exe. The other alternative there would be to not use a disk at all. Instead, what you'll do is if you have a network card that is what we call PXE compatible, that means PXE compatible, PXE standing for pre-boot execution environment, then what you do is during the startup phase, right after the BIOS has done its post, you'll see a message on the screen usually that says press F12 to boot from the network. You press F12, it will use an existing Windows DHCP server to allocate an address to that network card, and then it will load some other things such as the trivial FTP service, and it will then download files automatically from a predetermined network share that's been configured in such a way with a service for Windows 2000 Server or Windows Server 2003 that will then perform the rest of the installation for you. Now, the advantage of this is the network is going to have a lot bigger throughput than even a CD or a DVD, so network will probably be one of the fastest ways of installing. And you can make this an unattended installation by using an SIF file or a setup information file that is another option for you. Now, details about how to create your own network boot disk or put the drivers for CD, DVD on there, those are a little bit outside of our scope, but I will take you to this location. Go to this website that you see up here in the URL, and this guy has all kinds of information about how to create various types of boot floppies or CDs, boot CD being the most popular and the most useful of them all. And then it will load network drivers for you if you want, make connections to a resource. So it's very, very useful in being able to make a connection to wherever your installation files are, whether they're on CD or on a network resource. Another thing that I like is to create a drive image of some type. And again, you can use the drive image software, or you can use Norton's Ghost, or there are several other alternatives out there as well. Now, the problem with drive image is that each computer, for example, this Windows XP computer, if I wanted to image this computer that we're working with right now and transfer this image to other computers, that would actually create two problems right now. Number one, you're not allowed to have two hosts with the same IP address on the network. That would be easily fixed if I was using DHCP, so that problem might go away. The other problem, however, would be that each Windows 2000 or XP computer has something called a SID, which is a unique identifier that's true of only this computer. Now what would happen is I would have two computers with the exact same name and the exact same SID. As a result, I will wind up having potential problems and conflicts. So what we do to avoid that is we can use a Microsoft utility called sysprep, and there are other third-party products that do a similar function. But what sysprep will do is it allows me to take an image that I've already created, and then it will strip out any of the uniqueness about it. Its unique name, for example, its unique SID, anything else that would cause a problem with duplication on my network. Of course, if you're going to do something like this as well, make sure that you also have the appropriate licensing for each copy of the operating system that you deploy. All right, now since this was an upgrade, this is after the system has rebooted during my upgrade process from Windows 98, then it identifies that there were two user accounts that it noticed on the local system when I started the upgrade. And these are the two, the James I. Conrad account and then the administrator account. And so then I need to type in a password for these two accounts. So I'll just enter something in and click OK. And it does that so that it can have an account to work with that allows me to log on then. And if I choose options here, if I had a domain I was logging on, then I could do that. But otherwise, I'll just log in as whoever I am. I guess I'll just use my current account right now would be fine. And then I'll click OK. And then we'll see that we get a desktop here, and that will help to confirm that we did successfully install the operating system. All right, so it looks like I've properly installed the operating system here. At least we get a desktop and all the icons over on the side. This also is an indication that it was an upgrade because in a clean installation of XP, it only puts the recycle bin on the desktop. These are kind of leftovers given the fact that it was indeed an upgrade. If I had any start menu programs that I had installed manually besides the defaults, they would have also appeared here, so I would still retain those programs. If I want to check the device manager to see if I've missed anything, I'll show you another way to get to that as well. I can right-click my computer. Instead of choosing Manage and then Device Manager, I can just click on Properties, just another way to get there. Then go to Hardware, and now when I click Device Manager, it takes me to a dedicated console for only Device Manager. And it's, of course, not uncommon to see certain devices that did not get properly detected. So I need to find the Windows XP driver for these two devices in order to be able to access and use them from within Windows XP now. All right, now what I'm about to do is I'm going to start a virtual machine here that has no operating system on it whatsoever. This would be just like a clean or a bare install. And I've got a CD inserted there that's going to go ahead and boot from the CD. It's got the system files necessary for it, and I can load it without CD or with CD. This is just something that it was kind of homemade for me. You can make your own boot CD if you like, following Bart's instructions, which I showed you earlier if you want. And then it just goes ahead and loads the CD drivers. It's going to make the CD drive available to me then. And what I could do then is once this successfully boots, take out that CD and then put in a Windows XP CD. And now we see that that drive is mapped to drive Z, and from drive Z, go ahead and launch winnt.exe. Now, one thing you'll want to do with this as well, if you're going to run Windows winnt.exe from a command line, is to run something called Smart Drive, which will do caching for you, caching from the CD into RAM, and that'll make it operate faster and make it copy the files faster. So we'll just run smart drv. I don't need to enter in any parameters, just loading it at all will certainly help this situation. And then I'm going to go ahead and change the CD, which right now it's my boot CD. I'm going to put in my Windows XP CD and run winnt from that, and we'll take a look. Now then, I've gone ahead and shut that machine off because I'm going to run winnt in a different way. I could run in winnt from the method I just showed you, booting from a CD. One thing you do want to be careful of is it will go much faster during the installation and file copy phase if you type in Smart Drive. If you run Smart Drive, this is an old DOS command that would allow you to do caching. So it would cache information read from the CD, and by holding it in memory, it would be able to work with it much faster. Anyway, you would type SMARTDRV, and that'll take you a long ways to getting there. Also, if you booted from something like that bootable CD that I just had, or a floppy, and you did not have any partitions defined yet in any file systems, then what you would have to do is to create at least one formatted partition in order to continue with the installation process, because it needs to copy the files to the hard drive to do that. Now, my preferred method is to boot directly from the CD, and I've already got the CD installed there or inserted. So now when I boot from a Windows XP CD, it's going to detect that and prompt me to go ahead and do the installation this way. It didn't detect an existing operating system, so it went right into inspecting the hardware. And then now you can see here, if I need to install a SCSI driver, I can do that through the previous message that was down at the bottom of the screen. Now once this takes place, I'll just let it do its thing, and we'll continue on through the setup process from there. Now then, here during the setup process, it pauses here to ask me what I want to do. I can set up now by pressing enter. You can run a recovery console, which we'll talk about at a later time. That's useful for recovering substantially damaged or problematic XP systems. Or I can quit. I'm going to go ahead and press enter to proceed with the installation. Of course, here's the entire licensing agreement. We're going to pretend that we read through the whole thing, and then I'll press F8 on the keyboard to agree to that licensing agreement. Then what I need to do is to select a portion of hard drive space to create a partition. Right now I don't have any partition space. It's all unpartitioned, as you can see. So what I want to do is to create a partition or set it up on that partition. If I want to use all the available space, I'll press enter. If I want to create a partition and carve it up, I'll type C. I'm going to go ahead and press enter to go ahead and use all of that available space. And then notice that I can use FAT, which is really FAT32. or the NTFS file system. Always use the quick version, in my opinion, because the other versions down here at the bottom will also do a system check or a drive check to check it for integrity. Normally, I happen to know this drive is okay, so I'll just go ahead and choose the quick version. If you're really paranoid, you can choose one of the other ones, but it does take quite a while to format it, whereas this method is going to be quite a lot faster. Now, what we saw prior to this point was text mode, where we had the blue screen and we saw the license agreement and all of that. And now it goes into a GUI mode where we get, our mouse pointer and we get the fancy little graphics and all of this kind of stuff. And it'll continue to do this to a certain point, and after the reboot, I'll come back and show you some more. And then, of course, before we reboot, we do have to answer a few questions about how we want this installation to go. This is a typical example of what we call the attended installation, where I have to manually enter in all of these answers. An unattended installation will use a file that already has these answers supplied. I'm going to go ahead and just manually enter in these information. And for this information, whatever name and organization you use in here is the party that's legally liable for the proper licensing of the product. So I usually just put in a generic name there, or a better solution there even yet would be to put in your boss's name there. So he's legally liable or she's legally liable for the product. And then you'll, of course, enter in the product key. And once you've done that, you'll click on Next. So I've entered in that CD key, and then on the next screen here, I enter in the computer name and administrator's password. And then as we click on Next through the wizard, we select other things such as the time and the time zone. And I live in Arizona, where we don't observe daylight savings time, so we have our special time zone right here just for Arizona, because we don't want to extend our nights in the summertime because we're already burning alive in 115-degree heat. So we'll select those options and click on Next. Now, for the A+ exam objectives, this is another item that you'll need to know something about, and that is how to configure the network settings for your installation. I'll go ahead and choose custom settings so you can see all of the available options. Otherwise, if you just choose typical settings, it includes the typical things that you would need, like client for Microsoft Networks, file and printer sharing, TCP/IP, and some everything else that you see right here. These are also just the default settings, but I can then, from this point, configure these by installing or uninstalling additional clients and so forth. For example, for this, if I wanted to manually configure something, I could go to my TCP/IP properties, and I could enter in a manual IP address and subnet mask, and manually configured my DNS servers here as well. I'm actually okay with what we have here, but I just wanted to show you this so you could visually get an idea of what's available for you there. And then here's just something in my experience does not always work very well, but normally the default setting is to add it to a work group, which means it's not part of a domain that you would often see in a corporation. If I was in a company and I wanted to make it a member of a specific domain, I could enter that information right here, such as, nuggetlab.com or something. The problem is that rarely ever works. Frequently, I see that it is not able to find that domain on the network, and I have to manually do it later on. So for my purposes, I'm just going to go here. Now, that's not specifically an exam question or an exam objective in terms of whether or not that usually works. I'm just saying from my own personal experience. All right, now at this point, the system has gone ahead and taken all the information I already gave it, rebooted, and now it's going to give me this message that it wants to improve the visual elements, so it's going to automatically adjust my screen resolution. If you can read this, click OK. And then it's just going to go ahead and apply the resolution that it thinks will be best for my particular display properties. Now, of course, you can change that at a later time if you want. And then that's pretty much it. Shortly thereafter, we boot to this desktop, and the installation is complete. All right, now in this case, I'm going to go ahead and boot an operating system here, and I'm going to boot directly to the network using the method I talked about a little while ago, where you can use, in this case, something called Remote Installation Services, or RIS, to connect to a Windows 2000 or Windows Server 2003 server machine. As I start this virtual machine, you'll see that at the bottom there's a F12 prompt. I'll press F12 for a network boot, and it looks for a DHCP allocated IP address, which it receives, and I have to press F12 again, and then it receives this actual information from the Windows Server 2003 computer. It gives you an introduction. I press enter, and I have to enter in some credentials. Let me go ahead and enter those in. And it's going to join me, of course, to the accusource.local domain, which is one of my company's domains. So then I'll go ahead and Press enter here, and then it's going to go ahead and press enter again. It tells me the name of the computer that's going to be created, a globally unique ID that no other computer in the world will ever have, and then the server that supports this computer, which is my DC1 system. So then I'll simply press enter, and it's gonna go ahead and proceed through the installation process. The only thing here then that would be different is that, or actually the same, would be that I would have to still enter in all the same information that I entered in before. The different part is that instead of booting from a CD, I booted from the network instead. Now, at the risk of going a little beyond A+ exam objectives, I do have to do that just a tad in order to show you an unattended installation. Because what we do with this is we use something called Setup Manager, which is a Microsoft utility that you use to create all the answers to the installation process in advance, and then normally we'll use this on a number of different computers. But in order to get to this, I need to, I guess I'll right-click my computer in Explorer and go to some source files that I have, and I'll go down here to my Windows XP, where are they? Windows XP source files, and of course here's the i36 directory where I have my normal setup files. But what I want to do now is go to Support and then Tools. From within Tools, I see some other ideas here that I can get going. Then what I want to do in particular is to double-click on this deploy.cab file. Here's where my setup manager file is. A lot of this information is good, and a lot of it relates to sysprep as well. I'm just going to go ahead and grab all of this, and I'm just going to Control-C to copy it, and then I'm going to grab it and put it down into a location where I might normally be able to access it. Normally I put it in my Windows directory, but for the time being I'm just going to put this into my temp directory here. And then I'll be able to access Setup Manager, where I'll double-click on it to launch this utility. And then after reading the introduction, I'll click on Next to create a new answer file that I can use to fully deploy systems with very little, if any, participation on my part. Now, what kind of thing do I want to do? I could do an unattended setup, and what I would do with this is to save a file called winnt.sif to a floppy disk. And then when I run setup from a CD-based installation, for example, if I boot from the Windows XP CD, then it will automatically look for a file of that name on the floppy disk, and if it sees it, it'll use it in the installation process, so I don't really have to do much of anything else after that point. I can also use it with sysprep, which I alluded to earlier, is something that we use in conjunction with imaging software or remote installation services. Now, since I just showed you RIS a moment ago, I'll go ahead and use this method, and then I'll go ahead and click on Next. From here, I'll go ahead and identify the product that I want to use. Let me clean up a little bit there. The product I want to use is going to be Windows XP Professional. Notice that I can also do it for these other operating systems. And I want it to be a fully automated installation, and of course there are other options there depending on the level of interaction that you want to have. As I accept the license agreement and click on Next, I have to enter in some name and organizational information here. This again is for the licensing purposes the name of the party that's legally liable for proper licensing. So I enter in that information, then click on Next, and I can enter in, as you can see here, different characteristics of the display settings. I'll just leave everything as the default. And then the time zone will be the same as the server, but again, I can choose something else if I want. Wherever these places are. So I'll go ahead and click on Next then. And then I'll go ahead and enter in, of course, the product key and resume after this. And then here we enter in the administrator's password, and this has always been a cause for concern in the past. I'll go ahead and enter it in. But what we have here is, the reason why it was a concern is because this password will appear in plain text in the file that will be created here. But now you can encrypt the administrator password in the answer file. So that's kind of handy. All right, then we'll go ahead and hit Next. And I'm going to go ahead and just leave the typical settings. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail with a lot of the rest of this, because mainly I just want to create a file that you can see in action. Of course, you can choose different languages and everything. Otherwise, the default language will be selected. And I'll just Next through the end. Going to leave it in a folder called Windows, and if I want to install any printers, I can add printers in this as well, which is kind of handy also. That way I don't have to revisit the machine to go ahead and install printers for that user as well. If I have any additional commands that I want to run, any batch files or some kind of script or something that I also want to add in, I can do those here as well. And then I can just enter in a description for this if I like. For example, I put it here that it's fully automated, and then I simply click on Finish, and then I'll go ahead and save this file. Now that I've gone ahead and copied the file as necessary, I'm going to run RIS here again as a client, and I'm going to go ahead and press F12 again for my network boot. I do have to still enter in some credentials to identify that I have the authority to install things here and to join domains. So I'll enter in at least that much information. And then here I've got the unattended setup information file that I created. I went to my server and made it available here. So now once I go to this and press enter, it's going to prompt me to press enter to continue, and identifies the name of the client and everything. But after that, I'm pretty much done. Now I just walk to the next computer and start the whole thing over again, and I can go through an entire department, dozens, hundreds of computers if I want, to have them all installed automatically without any prompting from me. The only thing that would happen next would be that we would see the desktop, or we might see where it says that it's going to change my display resolution, but that's no big deal. A user will be sitting at the desktop by that point anyway. So that's pretty much it. I have a fully automated installation. In this nugget, we talked about upgrading and installing Windows. For example, maybe you have some upgrade considerations you need to think about in terms of whether your hardware can handle it, whether your applications are compatible, whether you can get the drivers you need, and we saw several of those considerations, as well as many of the installation options that you have presented to you. You saw those on a whiteboard, but you saw me also step through them during the installation process, which you can launch by using either WinNT or WinNT32. Now, I never actually typed those really when I launched an installation. If you boot from the CD, it automatically launches this. If you do an upgrade from within a previous version of Windows, it automatically launches this for you. Otherwise, you can manually type either one of those in. Now, when we take a look also at the installation, you can boot from a number of different types of media, from a floppy, from a CD. You can boot from the network, which you saw me do at the end there, when I booted from the network and then used that in conjunction with a setup information file to do an unattended installation. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.